So I'm going to be talking about Rails challenges. This is a warm-up act for a much more conceptual, in-depth, brain-stimulating talk. This is a little bit more about psychology rather than engineering. Here's the URL for the slideshow, and if anybody's got Hacker News karma points they want to gain, go ahead, post it, because it hasn't been posted anywhere yet, and this is a good controversial kind of discussion that people on Reddit and Hacker News like to engage in. So why should, and I'll talk in a minute about the fluffy cat, but why should we be trying to help out Rails beginners? I think it's because all of us are working in places, either we're in a startup that's desperately trying to recruit more engineering talent, or we're on a team where if we just had a few more senior level developers, maybe we could move a little faster, maybe the workload wouldn't be as killer. So it's up to us to try to bring those Rails beginners up to speed, because if we need more senior developers, we need more junior developers, and to have more junior developers, we need to help beginners get ramped up from HTML and CSS to web applications. 2 years ago, most of the people getting on board with Rails, most of you probably here in this room, already had experience as web application developers, already came from a background of Java or PHP, already knew some of the concepts and the principles of building a web application. But something has changed in the last maybe 2 years or so. People want to do web development. Instead of thinking about learning to use WordPress or a little PHP or studying a little JavaScript, they're saying, hey, I've got to learn this Ruby on Rails thing, even if they don't know what it is. So we're seeing a lot more people coming into the community as absolute beginners. And to accommodate that, we've got some really, really great books out there. You know, books by Ryan Biggs, Michael Hartle's tutorial are things we probably all recommend, something that I learned from, probably many of you learned from, but it's still really gauged at an intermediate level, not absolute beginners. Some assumptions are made. So I wanted to help out those beginners, so I just finished writing a book. It's just launching now with a Kickstarter campaign, if you want to contribute to getting it off the ground. And it's aimed at absolute beginners to introduce them to Rails, but in a way that introduces some real professional practices. So in writing the book, I had hundreds of people user testing it and giving me feedback, and I encountered a lot of challenges that people ran into as Rails beginners. So Rails is getting more complicated. You know, we may have gained mastery over the last few years, and you know, we struggle a little bit, keep up, Rails 4 is out, what's strong parameters, you know, what are concerns, whatever. But imagine a beginner, Rails just keeps getting more innovation, more powerful, turbo links, asset pipeline, all this stuff is coming on board, and there's just that much more to learn. As mentors, really it's up to us to help. How else are people going to get up to speed with Rails? So what are some of the strategies we can help beginners with? Think about the psychological phenomenon of resistance. When you start to feel overwhelmed, when you're tired and discouraged, when you've been banging your head all day trying to figure out some code, molehills start to become mountains. Little issues start to be really big issues. Is this a familiar feeling for anybody? Imagine what it's like to be a beginner and encountering Rails for the first time and not having had the satisfaction of building something, seeing something work, and encountering some initial challenges. Suddenly those challenges get really big. People are ready to quit. People are, you know, the resistance, the psychological phenomena begins to attach both to two categories of problems, both to imaginary problems and to real problems. Imaginary problems are problems like, oh my God, you know, I'm not smart enough to do this web development stuff. I'm not smart enough to learn Rails. I should have had maybe a computer science background in school. Or those of you who do have a CS background, you may be thinking, I shouldn't have wasted 4 years in CS. How am I going to learn this stuff? So those are imaginary problems. They just get blown up, big out of proportion. The problems that we can deal with as mentors are the real problems, because there are some real challenges to Rails, some genuine challenges. And when the resistance attaches to those real problems, we need a strategy for coping with that. So how do you overcome resistance? First of all, acknowledge that there is a real problem. It doesn't make Rails bad. It doesn't make Rails inferior. It just means that we have to recognize that there are some speed bumps, some hurdles. And as a mentor, helping out a beginner, help them scale down the magnitude of the problem. So instead of the mountain, let's get it back to the size of a molehill. Let's recognize and support that, yes, you may be encountering real challenges, but we can solve those problems. Everybody has. There are thousands, tens of thousands now of Rails developers who have overcome these problems. So how do we go about doing those? As mentors, probably not a good idea to simply solve the problem for a person. Don't just grab their keyboard and start typing in the code that they need. Instead, help them out with some resources, help them out with some problem-solving approaches. And so for this talk here, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, let's go through kind of a process of encountering some typical Rails challenges, some of them that have come up with the real beginners that I've worked with. And let's, as an exercise, think of some of the ways we could approach those problems, scale them down to scale down the magnitude of the problem. Challenge number one, it's difficult to install Ruby. I mean, we forget this, right? We've all got Ruby, we've all got Rails up and running, we've been running it for months or years or whatever, but it is the beginner's first big obstacle. And it's a significant obstacle for somebody who hasn't done software development before. For somebody who's only, installed consumer apps, this is nothing like they've encountered before. This is not just a drag and drop, point and click install. They're dealing with system software for the first time in their lives, perhaps. And compounding the problem, of course, we all know this. Every system is unique. Every system is different. Some of you may have participated in RailsBridge workshops, and Friday night they do an install fest where everybody comes and makes sure their computer is set up before they try actually participating in the workshop the next day. And that install fest can go on for hours. And it's not just people running on Windows, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it can be older versions of Macs that people haven't, updated the OS from, 10.5, and suddenly they realize that they need all these extra things installed, or maybe they installed some other software and there's some conflicts. So those are real problems to encounter. How do we go about solving those problems? Well, we've got a couple of approaches that have worked in the past, and as a community, we're getting better at it. We do have some attempts at building point-and-click single install click applications for installing the system software. For example, Rails Installer has been popular up until maybe the last few months. That was a package that you could install on Windows or on Mac and have a whole Ruby and Rails development environment set up. A couple of problems with Rails Installer that we don't have time to look at right now. It can create conflicts down the road. There's a lot of magic involved. Yehuda Katz has been working on a project called Kehoe, which is a sandboxed development environment that you can simply install on your Mac as a point-and-click consumer-type application. Not quite ready for prime time. But in the last 6 months, Michael Pappas in Poland has been working hard on RVM to make that very much a single-click installer for Ruby and Rails. RVM, the Ruby version manager. Now, I don't want to take sides. There's people here who like using RBNV, Sam Stevenson's project, CHRuby. These are all excellent tools that we as experienced developers use to switch back and forth between versions of Ruby and Rails. I particularly recommend RVM, though, to beginners because it uniquely has this ability to do a point-and-click install where system software that's needed on your machine gets automatically installed to the extent that is possible. So as mentors, we need to be aware of some of the current practices that are going to help beginners get up to speed. If nothing else works, I really like a new service called nitrous.io. It's a hosted development environment in the cloud. Basically, you sign up and you get within your web browser, a complete development environment with Ruby and Rails pre-installed. So if you're helping out a beginner, they can't figure out how to get started, they're having problems, and you can't figure out how to sort out that issue, just point them at nitrous.io. I've got an article installing Rails too. That'll help. Challenge number 2, Rails is a nightmare on Windows. Anybody here doing Rails development on Windows? Started. What was that? That's the answer, run a Linux VM. And I'm sorry to say, so here's the exercise. So many people use Windows. So many people, the only laptop they've got is a Windows machine. They want to do Ruby on Rails. They come to you as a mentor, a friend, or something like that. And you're like, forget it. it's not gonna succeed on Windows. You're gonna try to installing gems and they won't work. So how do you deal with that? They're just gonna say, well, why? That's not fair. You guys are so biased against Windows. Well, let's deal with it. The bias is there, but it's not simply prejudice. It's because Rails comes out of an open source environment, and most open source developers use Unix-based tooling. It's a historical accident. It isn't really any dislike for Bill Gates or the evil Microsoft empire. It's simply the fact that our environment has been built up using Unix-based tooling. Accept that. Not such a big problem because you can do Rails development if you've got a Windows laptop, but you'll have to do something like install a Linux virtual machine. You can use, again, I mentioned Nitrous.io. I like that because there's nothing to install. You simply sign up for an account. It's free for ordinary, small-scale Rails development, and you get a full-blown Linux environment in your web browser. Or download a Vagrant virtual machine. Rails Bridge virtual machine is a good one. There's one called Rails DevBox. You can do development on Windows, but as a mentor, you've got to help people out on that one. So other typical, now I called them Rails challenges, but they could also be called Rails complaints. It's the things you hear when people are like frustrated and they are thinking, maybe I should just try going back to PHP or something like that, or maybe this is too hard. Rails error reporting is cryptic. Is it? The stack traces are intimidating. The error messages are too technical. Why can't it be simpler? Well, how, as mentors, do we help them deal with that? Probably by acknowledging that, yeah, it is intimidating, but actually Rails error reporting is actually very good. It provides all the details that an experienced developer needs to solve a particular problem. Of course, on the computer can't say what you did wrong. The computer can only tell you what happened when you did it, when the error happened. So there is an inherent limitation there, but simply acknowledging that as a fact may help a beginner get over that hurdle, help them read the stack traces, point out that it's the first line in the stack trace or the second line in the stack trace that contains the error message that you need to cut and paste and Google or look on Stack Overflow. Stuff we all take for granted, of course, but think about it. From a beginner's standpoint, what would really be the most helpful thing that we could do to get them up to speed? Rails challenge number 4, there's too much magic. Now this is an interesting one. Our convention over configuration leads to some obscurity. Implementation, often hidden deep in the depths of Rails. Now when you encounter this Rails complaint, you've probably got somebody who in the future may be a senior developer that you want to work with. Because this is the Rails challenge that trips up the clever ones. It trips up the smart ones particularly. It trips up the people who really want to know how do things work? Because they're playing with Rails and they're building a controller and they're starting to scratch their head and wondering, okay, I've got this action in the controller. Well, where does that view come from? I don't see the code that produces that view. Well, we probably don't think about it anymore. We simply accept the convention that's there, but if you wanted to explain it, you could point out, well, actually there's some hidden code that we don't see. There's a Rails keyword called render, which by convention doesn't appear in the controller actions, but it's there and you could actually type it in and show them how it works. You could actually show that there's additional parameters that you can pass to a render keyword that renders without a layout, for example. So you could help them dig into the source code if they're really, really interested, maybe as an exercise in how to begin to read source code, or suggest that they just take on faith that it works, because really, isn't that what we all do? I mean, how much time do we actually spend digging in to see how render actually works in Rails? We probably don't. It's a nice exercise to dig into the source code sometime and take a look at it, but after a while, we just take on faith that it works. So along the same lines, challenge number 5, Rails contains a lot of things I don't understand. So many files and folders, if you look in the Rails directory structure, code that's unfamiliar. The big question, well, what parts do I need to know? As mentors, we can say, you'll gain your understanding over time. You don't need to know all of Rails to work with Rails, to build applications. And as experienced developers, we're always learning. There's aspects of Rails that, that are still new to me that I'm exploring. There's aspects of Rails that have just been introduced that I don't know anything about. Concerns. Maybe I'll skip that one entirely based on the advice given here. So help out the beginners by assuring them that it's okay not to know everything about Rails. There's too much to learn. Well, we all encounter that. Web development used to be a lot simpler. I remember when we started out, it was just HTML and Perl was all we needed to learn. But now, wow, JavaScript frameworks, of course, databases, SQL, NoSQL, and the list goes on, doesn't it? On and on and on. If you want to be a full stack developer, yeah, let's get familiar with all of that. As a beginner should at least have some sense of where the different pieces fit in and what you use to do what. But, the reality is we can't know it all. And one of the positive things, there's joy in learning. I mean, that's why we choose this profession and this field often. There's lots of great resources we didn't have before. Back in the days when it was just HTML and Perl, there wasn't anything online. There wasn't Code School, Rails for Zombies, tutorials, Treehouse, all these resources that we now have available to learn. So we can keep up. There's structured learning. There's more attention to pedagogy and how we learn. Certainly your career will never be dull, and you can specialize. That certainly helps people realize that they don't have to learn it all. Front end, back end, what floats your boat. Challenge 7, it's difficult to find up-to-date advice. Isn't that true? We've got new major releases of Rails every 1.5 to 3 years, 2 years on the average. If you're using Google or Stack Overflow to look for answers to problems that you've encountered, that advice is going to be out of date. So what can you do as a mentor? Show the beginners how to evaluate advice. Now, again, this is intuitive for us, but, we're probably aware that when you do a Google search, there's a little search tools menu that drops down. You could filter by date. Probably not everybody here uses that, but just being aware of that and pointing that out to a beginner to show them you can filter out so you can only see search results from, say, the last year. Stack Overflow doesn't have any feature like that, but show beginners how to check the dates in Stack Overflow. Show them how you go about interpreting a Stack Overflow answer to evaluate which of those. It isn't necessarily the one with the big green check mark next to it. It isn't necessarily the one with the most upvotes. Show them how you look at it, checking the date, evaluating those answers to see which of those answers has the greatest relevance to you, how you can follow a chain of other Stack Overflow answers. The related questions, related answers sometimes can be very useful. Challenge number 8, what gems to use? I mean, gems is where we get most of the power of Rails. It's why we grow so fast and have built so much momentum as a community. But how do you find the gems to use? Which gems are the best? What do you want to use for paginate? What do you want to use for authentication? Gem discovery is an art. We can share that with beginners. We can acknowledge that there is no perfect solution for finding gems. Ruby Toolbox is great. Most people here are probably familiar, probably have seen it. It's a great project to catalog and rate every gem out there, but it's maybe not possible to rate and catalog every gem. It's certainly a big problem to solve. Christopher, who's been working on that Ruby Toolbox project, struggles to maintain that site, so it's imperfect. Personally, I tend to get my clues about gems from example applications. I can encourage beginners to look for example applications, starter applications, not just the ones from the Rails Apps project, but the consulting companies. Thoughtbot, for example, has got some great starter apps that you can look to see what are these leaders in the community using as their favorite gems. And certainly, point out to beginners how important it is to keep up with the community. Follow Peter Cooper's excellent Ruby Weekly email newsletter, Peter Cooper's Ruby Flow, daily blog aggregator site. It's definitely you've got to spend your time keeping up with what's going on in the community to see what are the gems, first of all, that are being introduced, but also that other people are talking about as useful. Challenge number 9. Significant one when you get past the tutorial stage. How do you transition from just following tutorials to building your own applications? A question that beginners, even coming out of Dev Bootcamp or an App Academy, will be encountering as issues. Copying and pasting gets me started, but how do I build an application from scratch? And here's where, as mentors, as experienced developers, you can really help people. Focus on the process. Maybe we've got particular software development methodologies that we're using at work. We don't have to try to explain, all the aspects of Agile or something like that to, a friend who's just, trying to put a website together for their, club or football team or something like that. But introduce them to concepts like user stories, a great way to break down into discrete units, what your application is going to do. Suggest that they look for code samples and just maybe implement spikes, little pieces of the application to begin finding things that work and begin finding their, getting grounded with doing development on their own. Questions come up like challenge 10. I'm not sure where the code goes. Well, does this code go in the model or in the controller? And, automatically we know where it should go. We've been doing it for months or years or whatever, but actually if you think about it from the standpoint of a beginner, there's no, you can process, what's coming in, input from a form or something in the controller or in the model, or other places as well, certainly. Questions like, well, what if one of my controller actions isn't RESTful? I mean, how much do I have to keep to that REST model, and does it fit or not? Am I in trouble if it doesn't? So rather than directly answer those questions here, with mantras like, skinny controller, fat model, or, more sophisticated suggestions that, even the model can be thinned down and code moved to the lib folder. Just point out the importance of getting peer support, reading the blogs, studying example apps, and go to hack nights. Adrian, people here that I recognize from that great hack night that they run over at Carbon 5 once a month on Wednesdays. Ask for code review. Get people to help you out. Start pair programming. So those are 10 Rails challenges. I'm going to throw out an 11th bonus one that really doesn't fit. It's not really a problem that has anything intrinsically to do with Rails. Instead, it has something to do with our social structure and the environment we're in, which is that for some people coming into learning Rails, there is this challenge of people like me don't go into programming. Not every programmer looks like one. Though I look around this room now and I don't know that I can stereotype what a typical programmer looks like. Actually brings a great deal of joy to me to see the range of different faces and looks that we have here. Not everyone has the same background. And recognize if you haven't already, that being different sometimes can be challenging. Sometimes it can involve self-doubt. If you don't see people who are like you doing the thing you want to do, you wonder, especially we're talking about that phenomenon of resistance, when those molehills turn into mountains, when resistance attaches to imaginary problems, that's when the questions come up like, well, maybe somebody like me shouldn't be doing programming because I didn't have a computer science background or whatever, So we can be more welcoming as a community. And it's not about, because this is something, you'll see on Reddit or Hacker News, that brings out the trolls. Somebody posts something about a Rails Girls workshop or something like that, and suddenly people are saying, well, why do women get special privileges and get to go to workshops for free? And the trolling goes back and forth and back and forth. But it's not really an ideological problem. It's not really an issue of values, though you certainly can look at it that way and debate it. As engineers, I think we simply should optimize for inclusion. Companies that have a diverse workplace tend to be more profitable, tend to be more successful. We're not having a talk about diversity here in the workplace, so we don't need to go into why that might be. It's a fact. As developers, we tend to be curious. We like to travel to foreign places, meet different people. Same thing. It's kind of fun to have a range of people in the workplace who have different backgrounds, to encounter, to hear their stories, their life stories, the kind of problems they've dealt with. So that's just all reasons that as engineers we should find ways to make our workplaces more inclusive and include those people who may be feeling, I'm not sure I really belong here as a developer, because that's a challenge that we certainly can overcome. Again, I like to mention Railsbridge and Rails Girls because they're organizations that do workshops here locally that bring in more people for diversity in our workplaces. So that's all I'm going to talk about. And if you want to discuss, did anybody post this to Reddit or Hacker News? I don't know if it's there. But if it's there, that's a good place to discuss it if it ended up posting. And I will get together with Joel and track down the first 3 phone numbers that he got and connect with you so you can have a hat. And please keep in mind that this is a chapter that's excerpted from my new book, and hopefully that book will help beginners get up to speed as well. Thanks very much. I'm glad I was able to be here with you.